Pleasant good afternoon to you on a Friday if you're on the East Coast, lunchtime if you're West. Before I get started, I just want to give a big shout out. I just saw her name, Dr. Elizabeth Z. Lacey. She was a compatriot of mine. We did our PhD in the exact same lab. So she can tell you, if I was a good grad student or not. I'll let her decide that. But yeah, Z was wonderful, and Z left the lab before I did, and just happy to see you again, Z. I really wish now this was in person. Next time, perhaps. Thanks for the invitation, and I always really take it as a privilege, a humbling privilege, to every time I get an opportunity to talk about this. I think I struggle a little bit sometimes with the term inclusive teaching, because really where I want us to get to is a space where to teach well is to be inclusive. That's an assumed part of what it means to have a classroom and to have the privilege to have that classroom. But until then, I understand that we're on a journey. And I think we're on a journey where many of us, even all of us who are well-intentioned and perhaps are part of the choir, we are trying to understand and really wrap our heads fully around what it means to engage in this practice. And honestly, I get it. I get it. Being a college professor in the US, to me, has to be one of the most interesting, maybe a little confusing, but partly ludicrous professions in the country. And I'll tell you why. Think about it. If you wanted to be a medical doctor, what would happen, right? You'd be a STEM major, you go to med school, you do a residency, then you'd practice. If you wanted to be a lawyer, you'd be an English major, political science major, you would go to law school, you'd be an apprentice, and then you practice. If you want to teach at the college level, you spend 6 years studying the left side of one molecule, become the world's expert in that little thing, get 8 papers out, get the job and say, oh, by the way, there's a class over there that you have to teach. Somehow, this is the one thing where we've decided that either we don't need actual training to do this job, or maybe what institutions are trying to communicate to us is, well, what we really value about your presence here is all the other things, not the classroom. See, here's the thing, my friends. I know I'm here to talk about inclusive teaching, and we will. But we can't continue to ignore the elephants in the room. We can't continue to just have these conversations and give people all these strategies and here's why it works and social justice curriculum. I'm for all of that. But you have to start talking about systemic change. You have to start comparing salaries of research faculty versus lecturers. You have to start talking about how teaching is evaluated. You have to start talking about who you grant tenure to and how those things are evaluated and how much teaching counts. You have to start talking about hiring practices and how much you demand these skills from day one. And while I'm happy to come and commune with the choir, while I'm happy to come and share data and encourage you and ask you to keep on doing what you're doing, for those of you who are so positioned, I'm asking you to also pay attention to the aspects of your institution where you can make change that affects everyone. That we go beyond one classroom and you start thinking about, this is just the culture of what it means to do what we do. I wrote this many, many years ago, mostly in response to something I think that really developed in my field, to the extent that what I do is a field, science education, discipline-based science education, where the active learning mafia had kind of taken over the conversation. And I mean, I say that in jest mostly. I do active learning, I believe in it. I'm not trying to say it's a bad thing here, but I think one of the unfortunate things I think that happened in that time period was this sense that if I can just get a list of 12 things to do in my class on Monday, everything will be fine. And I'll tell you, I'll just give you a quick story here. When I initially wrote this paper, before it went to Cultural Studies and Science Education, I had sent it to another journal who responded and said, yes, we get all its inclusion stuff and we believe in it. But see, what our faculty really need is some strategies. We need you to just give us a list of things. And I'm like, that's not how this stuff works. This is not a checkbox thing. You don't checkbox your way to equity. You sit and you take time to understand how inequity has happened first before you design the solutions around equity. And given that we have this burnout culture and typically faculty life, it's oversubscribed, right? You're doing more things than there's available time. I understand the temptation for that list. But here's why I had to ask my friends and colleagues to maybe step back and be a bit more disciplined in this approach. And what you would find in that stepping back is that scholars have been talking about culturally relevant pedagogy and equity and civic engagement and social justice for over a century. This is not new. John Dewey's work is not new. Paulo Freire is not new. Miles Horton is not new. Martin Luther King even spoke about education when he was an undergraduate at Morehouse College. These are new principles. So if you read this paper, there's no Dewsbury effect, right? I didn't invent anything. My goal here was to simply re-centralize the voices who have been preaching to us for decades that education is about enlightenment. Education is a human endeavor. Education involves people. So before you decide how many clickers to use and how many groups to put them in and how many interrupted questions you put into that lecture, there is some work you have to do on relationship building to make all that stuff matters. To put it a different way, my friends, if my student is not mentally and emotionally and spiritually invested in the experience, if they don't feel like they belong in that room, if they don't believe that I have their back and my goal there is to facilitate their success, if I am not explicit about that, if I don't have an understanding of their backdrop and where they're from and what has informed their presence there, if I'm not reflective on my own journey and what I bring to this space because of my social position, all the clickers in the world doesn't matter. And that's where, for those of us who are raised as subject matter experts and convinced that our subject matter expertise is all that is required to be effective in the classroom, that's where we have to be willing to be part of a new learning journey. That's where we have to be willing to get back into the literature, not the literature in our discipline, the literature about how society works and how it has been constructed, and why red-line neighborhoods in major cities are still have the same income gap they had over a century ago. We have to be willing to learn that stuff. So the left side of the model is circled in red for a reason because, and as I'll unpack over the next half an hour, building the relationships is what matters. Before I decide what strategies I use, how I set up classroom climate, how I leverage the other services on campus to the service of inclusion in the classroom space, there's a lot of time that is spent figuring out what that relationship is going to look like. So as a mini case study, I'm going to talk to you about what has always been my favorite class, intro bio. I'm at Florida International University now. I was at University of Rhode Island for 7 years. That's where I was tenured, and so I've been at R1 universities, and as I'm sure some of you have seen this, how research faculty typically run, sometimes literally, from intro classes. And I get why. I'll be honest, I get why, because if what's being communicated to you that your permanency of employment depends on your research program more than anything else. From an economics perspective, you will orient your professional behavior to the thing that's rewarding you. You may not intend to do bad things. You may not dislike students. You may even love to be an inclusive instructor. But mortgages don't pay themselves. So if tenure has to be received, tenure has to be received, right? But I was just never good at that. I'll be honest with you. I was never good at plantation politics. I had well-meaning people who would come up to me and say, you know, Bryan, you know, you're assistant professor, like your job is to get tenure. I was like, that makes no sense. How is getting tenure a job? Teaching is a job. Doing research is a job. Solving interesting problems about the relationship between education and society, that's a job, that's a purpose. Tenure, my friends, don't get it twisted. Tenure is a yardstick. It's a measuring tool. And be very careful, because sometimes measuring tools get divorced from the things they're measuring. And if you're not paying attention to that, you can find yourself just get tenure, and say, wait a second, are you actually measuring teaching and learning? Are you actually measuring the impact of what this person is doing? Just because it's easy to count papers and count dollar signs, you can ignore the rest? So I took the challenge on for intro bio. Intro bio to me is more about intro than bio. I love bio, but intro bio is really more about intro, because once you figure out the intro part, the bio is actually not that hard. Like the most beautiful moments of being a teacher is that moment, and I'm sure all of you know it, that moment where the students just get it. Just wait a second. This is not that bad. I could actually do this. And then what starts off as a you know, all this technical language and this struggle turns into now I actually want to know what's next. And that's the job of an intro class. So all of the sociologies and the psychologies associated with being in your first college science class, being surrounded by, in my case, 155 students, right? People with different secondary preparation levels, fixed mindsets, fear, sense of belonging, stereotype, threat, all of these things. That's the kind of thing I have to work through before I see people start to take off. And that's what makes intro bio both challenging, but beautiful. So I'll tell you a little bit more about me. And I think it's important to sort of model what I'm asking of you here. That I bring my whole self to everything I do. You know, I don't, there's no Professor Bryan and home Bryan, and no, there's just Bryan, right? And I'm a mixed bag, right? You know, Z could tell you I have a thick accent. You know, I'm from Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean. Was born and raised there 19 years. I came to America in 1999 for college. I went to Morehouse College. I just want to show some love to all the HBCUs with the bomb threats, which is foolishness. So please stay safe out there. And I really had a privilege of coming here on a full scholarship. That's undergrad, and then went to grad school at FIU, which is where I've returned to do my job. And I bring a lot of identities to the table, right? I bring an immigrant identity. I bring somebody who's a person of color. I bring somebody who identifies as male. I also bring somebody who's the son of a pastor. And, you know, I don't practice anymore. Well, actually, I stopped practicing a long time ago. But I bring that up, well, partly because, you know, I'm still recovering a little bit. My dad unfortunately passed away on New Year's Eve at my house a month ago, and you know, it was a tough couple of days, but you know, Father Time is undefeated. But one of the things I would say is I hadn't fully internalized how much growing up with him would come to impact how I do my practice in the present day. Don't worry, I don't pick up collection in class. I am tempted. Dry erase markers have gone up at Office Depot apparently, but I don't do that. But I do internalize this notion of responsibility. My dad always considered himself a pastor, not a minister, not a reverend, not a priest, a pastor. And that's because the word pastor comes from pastoral farming, to take care of sheep. And the thing with pastoral farming is that you take the sheep out to graze at some new pasture. And sheep being sheep, they could go astray, they could one day get distracted. But as a shepherd, it's your responsibility to ensure that at the end of the day, the amount of sheep you left with is what you brought back. And you had to account for that when you got back to the main house. So in terms of ministry, pastor meant you took responsibility for your congregation. And in the same way, I stand in front of my classroom and I tell them on day one, look to your left, look to your right. That person next to you is someone who you'll open a business with. That person next to you will be your best study partner for physics. That person next to you will be the person who figures out question number 6 on the 3rd problem set. That person next to you might become your best friend and you might become roommates next year. And all of you, no matter what your background is, myself and my learning assistants, take very seriously your intellectual and social growth over the next 15 weeks. We have the privilege to be with you. So no, I don't go to the dorm room and do the homework for them. But I put a lot of energy into figuring out what is the thing that you need to be inspired to be your best self. And that's something I learned from my own journey. I don't know what's yours, and I'm making this personal because you're not me, I'm not you. And I'm hoping that in the same way I reflect in this way, that you think back to what was your Damascus moment. What's the thing that makes you be in that space in a transcendent way, in that classroom space? So it's important for me to get to know who the students are. I know part of what you might be thinking now is, did you mention 155 students? Like, you need to get to know all of them? The short answer is yes, right? The long answer is, obviously, 155 students every semester is not going to be my best friend, right? But I want you to maybe broaden how you think about, quote unquote, getting to know somebody, right? Be nice if all American universities had class sizes of 18 and it was like a seminar class and we all could just have these wonderful, chats about DNA structure over coffee, but that's not the case, right? Many of us are in state schools, large classes. We have to kind of figure out, right, how to make these classes a community in spite of the numbers. And I know 155 is not as big as some other classes, but it's big-ish, right? If I could call it that. And I want to message early to them, like, what I'm interested in is not just you as a biologist, is you as you, right? What's your why? What's that thing that motivates you? So the first assignment is National Public Radio. This is the website. This I Believe essay. And I literally copy paste the prompt. Cindy, does your cat have a question? Or I literally copy paste the prompt and post it on my LMS. Describe the values that shape your deepest passions. And in my case, because I only have 155, I read every single one of them. And boy, they write. I feel this assignment is similar to when I try to encourage students to do study abroad, which I do all the time. A lot of them do because I show them how to do it cheaply or for free or whatever. But many times, and many of them would come back and say, you know, Bryan, I did it because you said it would be good or whatever, but I didn't realize how good or how transformative it was until I did it. And I feel like I've never been able to explain to students how transformative going somewhere else and being immersed in a new culture and finding parts of yourself you didn't know. I've never been able to explain that fully before they did it. They've only really understood the full impact after the experience. And I feel the same about this assignment. Like I talk about this assignment around the country all the time. And honestly, it's only after faculty take a leap of faith and do it, and they're like, damn, never knew my students had those thoughts in their head. I taught in New England. Students were writing about parents dying of heroin overdose. Talking about food insecurity. I mean, they would talk about big things. They would talk about pets they love, you know, being children of divorced parents. I mean, they would open up. And then they would also talk about practical things like, you know, my parents want me to be a doctor, but I'm not really a science person. So me now, as an instructor, when I see that kind of language, that's saying to me, okay, I get what you're saying. You haven't had good experiences in science yet. So now my job is to create those experiences that your brain can now refer to show you that this is in fact something that you are capable of doing. I have to take you from that fix to growth. I have to get you to believe. I have to get you to see that running into something technical that you didn't understand the first time is not a problem. It's not a confirmation of any identity you have. It's simply part of the process. And I start getting that information from day one. But that's only as good as how much I follow up, right? I'm a very big believer in dialogue. It's a term that Paulo Freire has used. Many of you probably, you know, have read his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And I want to ensure that you have an expanded view of what the term means. You're not always going to get a chance to sit and have one-on-one for 45 minutes. But Elizabeth Mohay said in a 1996 paper, I don't teach subjects, I teach students. I don't teach subjects, I teach students. See, in our world of subject matter, expert is the only one who gets to teach class. We wrap all of our pedagogy around doing the subject matter stuff. Please do not go back to your campuses and tell people that we brought this dude named Bryan who told us we don't have to teach any content. Yes! No, that's not what I'm saying. The content very much matters. But you teach students, the content's a part of it. And the minute you start to internalize that statement, you'll find yourself being free of some of the very archaic structures around you that reinforce this message that you're there to teach subjects. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 2 to 3, that's class. What about when you run into them in the hallway? What about when you run into them on the quad? What about when you're exchanging emails? You're teaching students. I'm not saying that when you run into them, you pull out your PowerPoint slides and start talking. I'm saying that you're always building that relationship. So when I see them, I'm probing, I'm asking, hey, so how are you doing? How are your other classes? How did that last class when we talked about osmosis? How did that land for you? Was there anything that still like we always in a mode of figuring out what's the next thing. So every interaction you have with the student is an opportunity for education to happen. So there are students I've run into years after I've taught them, graduated even. I would say things like, yeah, man, when you said that thing in class, it really just changed my mentality and how I thought about my life and my work. I don't remember what I said, but it doesn't matter. They remember. And that's the dialogue. You don't get to have just a bunch of one-on-ones, right? Sometimes it's just, be attentive. Even when you're lecturing, even when you're explaining things over email, be attentive. We are sort of constant mentors in this space. So I just want to highlight a couple of things. You could probably already tell IntroBio is a lot of moving parts. And I really, again, I want to just say again how much I appreciate this invitation, because I'll be fully honest with you, your group wasn't on my radar until I started to talk to Michael and Cindy, and then, I read a bit more of what you've done. And, if I'm to fully confess, it's where I would like to see science and science teaching move towards. One of the things I tell the students on the first day of class is you will never pick up a book about swimming, read the whole book, and then go swim across a lake, right? The notion of doing that makes no sense. So why is it we meet here 3 hours a week to talk about the text, to talk about science? That's not what scientists do. We don't gather from 2 to 3 Monday, Wednesday, and Friday to discuss DNA. We run experiments. We collect data, we critique it, we write about it, we explain it, right? And so I would love to see more groups like this, push our teaching to the doing of science. And I know we're better than what we used to be. There's cures, there's all these things now, but it's just interesting how the gather together and 40 slide a class model is still sort of the standard bearer of what it means to have a science class. So the class is very, very active. There's a lot of discussions, a lot of talking, and I think I want to just talk about 2 quick things here that hopefully makes my point about how in a science class, equity and inclusion is something that matters and can be focused on, right? First, I want to say that we have to kind of push past the representation slide thing. I'm not hating on it. You definitely should have, in talking about science, definitely please, use diverse examples, bring in our history. But equity and inclusion is more than that. In equity and inclusion, you are taking some of the questions we asked about why we even have a classroom in the first place, and we are pushing it to a futuristic lens. 20 years ago, it was all about what do we want students to know. Then, thankfully, active learning forced us to ask, what do we want students to do? I am asking you, who do you want students to become? That's a different type of question, because you can develop all the skills in the world. But if you went through this institution and you didn't have an opportunity to fully engage difference and discuss difficult topics with people from different ideologies, or solve a difficult problem with somebody who brings a different viewpoint and angle with it, you have been denied a really critical component of what it means to be educated. Because like it or not, we still have to live in this same society together. That social contract, we don't opt out of. So whatever profession you land in, let that business office, let that mayor's office, let that doctor's office not be the first time that you had to encounter difference. So to put this a different way, for people who sometimes have, not come at me like in an aggressive way, but say like, oh, Bryan, I don't disagree with you, but, I teach physics. So, that stuff is not really appropriate for my class. No, you teach students. So what happens in the teach subjects model is diversity, equity, and inclusion gets outsourced to the MLK breakfast. Let's wait till Res Life has an event. They have a food festival because we celebrate different cultures here at University of X. And I say to you, no, this is IntroBio. And we talk about how biological science is done. And sometimes when biological science is done, the biases, the histories, the prejudices that we as humans often carry get brought to the process of asking and answering questions in science. And that, my friends, is how we ended up with things like the American Breeders Association. That's how we ended up with things like Mankind Quarterly. That's how we ended up with things like Maurice Wilkins. That's how we ended up with people like Marcus Sims. That's how we ended up with Francis Galton, all rubber stamped by the scientific establishment. That's how in the 1970s, we were still sterilizing people we considered disabled. So I'm despite my tone, I'm a positivist, right? I just got over 2 weeks of COVID. I was telling the organizing committee that I feel great. I had 3 vaccines. They made that stuff in like 3 days. I'm like, wow, science is a phenomenal thing. Like I am team science, man. I am not hating, but I'm a truth teller. So when I put students in groups, which I'm calling on this slide opportunities for dialogue, I socially engineer the group so that they're different ethnically, they're different by stated gender, they by preparation level. And we spend the first 2 days of class talking about how to have difficult dialogues, and we give them an example and how to do something called apophatic or active listening. Why? Because they do group case studies on things like Rosalind Franklin and Maurice Wilkins. They do group case studies on the Tuskegee study. They do group case studies on who's been impacted by COVID and why. And they bring the social context to that conversation. So it behooves me to give them the tools to have that conversation well. And that, my friends, is what I will argue they will remember more when they go forth from your institution than how many hydrogen bonds is in each turn of the helix. Not that that's not interesting, because it is. But there's a human side to this as well. Another quick point, we renamed our office our student hours. And I have my first generation students to thank for that, of which I was one as well, by the way. We are a very interesting group. And if you're a first generation student in this audience, you know exactly what I mean, right? That hidden curriculum, boy, some. You know, I had some students come up to me like, that was just telling me, hey, it's a big school, you have a bunch of professors do the research, have you considered joining a research lab? It's like, oh, we thought you're not supposed to like ask a professor about their research until you're a senior. Where are you getting this stuff? I mean, it's like, and one of the things I was told was, we thought that office hours was when the professor got a chance to check their email. I said, okay, first of all, if you think I could check all my email in 2 hours, 1 day a week, you haven't been, you don't know what we do, man, because like, anyway, that's a sidebar, right? But then you have the other problem where some people, how should I put it? Don't necessarily disabuse students of the impression that office hours is a thing for them, right? So you leave, the union contract says you have to have office hours 2 hours a week is mandated. So leave that door like a half an inch. And then when you hear these students coming down the corridor, you make sure you stay at your oversized screen and don't move and keep typing. And then when they realize you're busy, so they don't come in, whew, all right, have to get this granted. And the thing is, even if everything I said wasn't true, right? And all the students understood and they came to your office, unless your office is the Oval Office, how many could fit, right? Like, so just do the math. You could only really see a couple at a time. So which limits automatically who can benefit from that experience. We go to the first floor of the dome, right? I have colleagues in other universities who will go to the student commons, go to a coffee shop. In my case, it was a dome, big lounge, 45 chairs, 3 whiteboards. We averaged like 35, 40 students a week. I mean, I could get into a whole separate lecture about things like John Henryism and sense of belonging, but you have to understand that for some students, that walk down the corridor to your office can feel like walking the Green Mile. And there's some people who will say, oh, you're holding their hands, they're cuddling. No, 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 my friends. Like, I'm trying to get them in the door. If I just be a hard ass about this and say, no, I'm here, you just need to come, you need to figure it out. And that's the reason why somebody didn't come and get the help they needed, or somebody didn't feel like they could do the class, and that's the 30% who fail. Who wins in that model? What's the point of that? So when I get them in that dorm, yes, we can kick it, and we do this sort of each one teach one thing where, you know, one student goes to the board, explains the concept and gets some feedback, and they do it again. And, you know, there's work in small groups, and then, you know, it's very casual, right? And so when I'm talking to them, I could just talk to them about just regular things and demonstrate how non-scary this interaction can be. And message in the process that, so when you go on to Bio 102, the next semester, your future science classes, you need not be afraid of who teaches that class. You see the benefit of having this interaction regularly. So it's not that you'll get your hand held until you're 80. It's I need to welcome you into this space. And now that you are welcomed, be agentic about it. It's yours. Take ownership of it. It's your tuition dollars. So in 2014, when I started at my last institution, there were 3 sections of microBREW, and you had to, the rule is you have to get a C or above to go on to the second semester, right? And my new section became the 4th section. And unproductive grades meant that you got less than a C. So students from historically marginalized backgrounds were getting C's 2-3 times the rate of white students, depending on which section you were in. And we were no better in the beginning. And one of the critical decisions we made we teach students and not subjects is that we are going to have to make some decisions about what actually needs to be covered. We tend to live in a very, somebody handed me this syllabus when I got hired, and so therefore that's what I'll do until I get permanent employment type culture. And so that perpetuates the obsession with coverage. We also, particularly intro level, get handed 60 chapter textbooks. And in theory, we know we can't cover it all, but there's a way it sort of primes people into over assigning without really asking critical questions like, why are you having them read this 25-page chapter for 1 day of class? So we cut about 40-45% of the content, right? I mean, it was a very careful process, right? It wasn't just, you know, from page 3 go on kind of thing. Things that were redundant, you know, really figure out what concepts need to be known. So we would have time to really engage in some skill development, confidence building, you know, being able to write better, just all those kinds of, you know, bring people into the space a bit more intentionally. And obviously not just close the gap, but reduce the DFW rate to under 10%. So the obvious critique was, well, you know, well, if you're going to talk about less stuff, obviously they'll do better. And you're doing them a disservice because when they go on to the higher classes, they'll fall flat on their face. I said, okay, well, let's take a look at that. So we looked at 4 groups. Stay with me here. There were 4 sections of the first semester of microBREW and 2 sections of the second semester. In one of the second semester sessions, the person taught very much in my style. So if you were a student and you were successful at getting at the 200 level course, you either had a whole year of very traditional teaching, 1 semester of it, the first semester, 1 semester of it, the second semester, that's group 3, and then, or a whole year of inclusive teaching. And so if you had that whole year of inclusive teaching, remember, you would have been exposed to about 40% less content. right? And so what we looked at was the average grades and represented as sort of GPA points of the students in each of those 4 groups, right? So B was just the first semester people, S was just the second semester people, C was a whole year of traditional teaching, and BS, which are initials, by the way, not what you think it is, were the people who had that full year. Even if those points were the exact same height, I could tell you they covered 40% less stuff and did just as well. They actually did better. If you teach people how to learn, it actually kind of confuses me why we obsess with content, because just intuitively, all of us know that in 4 to 6 years of college, there's no way you could cover all there is to know about any subject. Why not spend that time focusing on teaching people what it means to be self-regulated learners? I want to close real quick by introducing you to this is the first group of students I ever taught. And Z might recognize this picture. It's the Florida Everglades, a beautiful place. If you ever come down to Florida, you should check it out. Because they have these really cool things. It's mostly like it's mostly low, but then there's these points where it raises, and then there's these pools where alligators live in. So yes, there's alligators where those students are, but they're friendly. There's an ecology lab, and that's we take them there. And I'll be honest with you all. When I was a grad student, I was trying to avoid teaching. I was literally told to my face, if you want to be successful in grad school, teach as little as you can. Try to get an R-ratio. But when I did my master's and PhD at FIU, and when I started the PhD, that was kind of by rule I had to teach, and everything changed. And I feel very privileged to be able to share that with you, because I know a lot of people do jobs and are well compensated and maybe even enjoy their jobs. But I really found a calling. And it's referred to as a calling because a calling is something that you respond to, it's something that you answer. Z could tell you we've done 4,000 or 5,000 dives over 6 years in Florida. Beautiful. But when I thought about what I wanted to do for the next 4 or 5 decades of my life, there was no comparison. And it was because when I was able to talk to them about who they were, and they would tell me stories about being first-generation Americans and first-generation college students and what being in that space meant to them, it became painfully obvious how distant what we were doing in the classroom that passed as curriculum was from what their expectations and hopes were for an experience in science. And that's all this is, right? It's yes, there's strategies, there's tools, there's books, there's workshops, go to all of it. But sometimes we overcomplicate things and don't realize that some of the best data about what could make our classrooms inclusive are typically sitting right in front of us. We just have to put the time in to ask. Thank you so much for hosting me on this Friday afternoon. We have a few minutes for questions, but if we don't get a chance to holler today, you can find me anywhere here, email, Twitter, whatever. And I enjoy having these conversations. I know these are things you have to process, right? And so things pop up in your head 1 week, 2, 3 weeks from now, shoot me an email. I promise you I'll answer. Thanks, Cindy.